Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I am honored to have with me an Emmy-winning producer, writer of fiction on women in the workforce, Pamela Ryckman. Pamela, I'm a fan. We've talked a few times. Your book that we want to highlight for this podcast is a fascinating story of Candace Pert, Genius, Greed, and Madness in the World of Science. Honestly, I never heard of Candace Pert, and I should have, because she's really had a major influence on our world today. And we're gonna get into it, but first I'd like to laud you a little bit more for my listeners, because they love when I have famous people on who do interesting things.
You're
So,
very
in
kind.
addition to this latest book, your first book was called Stiletto Network: Inside the Women's Power Circles That Are Changing the Face of Business. And this presaged the Me Too movement. And you talked about the secret society of the world's most powerful women, and how they were working to network and to fight the patriarchy, which is still too strong. And I'm speaking as a white privileged male. I think that's true. And you're also the executive producer of The Flag Makers, the documentary by Oscar-winning Cynthia Wade and Sharon Lise, as well as researcher on Wade's Netflix series, Mer People. You've written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, a million TV shows you've been on. You also consult for global corporations, and you've done some really interesting things with Tina Brown and Credit Suisse, launching Women of Impact to find solutions for problems women face in business, still do. And with Shaquille O'Neal and Credit Suisse, you launched Momentum, Black Men's Leadership Retreat, to focus on job creation, economic empowerment in the Black community. So anyway, you have a master's in journalism from NYU. And let's get into this fascinating woman. Holy mackerel. She was a maverick. She was brilliant, but she was cunning, and she discovered the opioid receptor, which was like, whoa. And then the pharmaceutical industry was like, how can we exploit this technology? Anyway, how did you get
100%.
interested? How did you get interested in this woman, first of all? And then let's give our listeners the overview of why she's so fascinating.
The background of how I came to this story is fun too. So I'm glad you asked. Thank you. And by the way, I love your work, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you so much for having me on. And I will say, as you know, you can see in my career, I've sort of done a number of things. And a lot of what I will say is sort of they're all under the umbrella of hopefully equality and wanting to make the world a better place. And I really am mission driven in my work, and I love telling stories, but I particularly love telling stories that, especially when it's a story like Candace, that forms the launch pad to discuss bigger issues in society, that really illuminates, where we are as a society right now and how did we get here. And I think Candace was really absolutely one of those stories. And, it's why I became a journalist in the first place. It's how I came to write Stiletto Network, because I think, what they say is research is me search, and that we write the books. We do the work that we need at any given point in time. At that point, when I found this inspirational story of sort of women banding together for success, I had three little babies, and three kids under 5. And I was like, holy cow, how do other women do this? And I think that led to a natural affinity towards sort of women's stories, women in the workforce. How did we get here now? And it was through both that sort of inherent interest and simultaneous inherent interest in integrative medicine and holistic health that I found Candace Pert, because I didn't know who she was either, which is kind of incredible. I mean, she really did paradigm shifting work in multiple fields and has really been lost to history. So, and what I can say now, sort of equating it to the work that's being done, that's perhaps most well known is Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, has been
Right.
on the New York Times bestseller list for years now, right? He doesn't name check Candace, but his entire book is based on her work 40 years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
now
Mm-hmm.
suddenly what has become the work that she did, linking sort of mind and body, that she did 40 years ago in the early 1980s, is finally now getting widespread recognition, but it's not even linked to her name. So, and
Right.
then I can do a deeper dive into sort of exactly what she did and when she did it. But that really is the overview. Here's this sort of, when I came to Candace's story, I read her 1997 memoir and I was like, holy cow, this is like Hidden Figures meets A Beautiful Mind. And
Hidden Figures. And Hidden Figures, if I remember, are brilliant Black mathematicians that were behind the space program, that without
that's
them, it wouldn't have happened.
That's exactly right. These women who had been, until a book sort of illuminated their story and then it became a movie, really
Right.
had been lost to history, at least sort of popular history. They weren't
Right.
regularly taught in school. And I think that has been the fate of many women in many different arenas throughout history. And then the
Mm-hmm.
beautiful mind part comes in because Candace was a genius, but she had her own struggles with sort of mental and emotional health. And so I think that that part of the story resonated initially as well. And exploring those issues of what is genius, how does one cultivate it, and when does it sort of, what is the line, and sometimes the blurred line between genius and madness.
Yes. And she also was involved with Peptide T, I believe, that was so important for fighting AIDS, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, in a funny way. So, I mean, another good way to sort of give an overview of Candace is to say, I mean, I like to say that she's like a Forrest Gump type figure. She played major seminal roles in three major movements in not only American science, but in politics. So the first is the opioid crisis. As you mentioned earlier, she discovered the opiate receptor, initially thinking that she was helping to eradicate drug addiction. In the early 1970s, Richard Nixon poured a ton of money into sort of curing heroin addiction because so many soldiers fighting in Vietnam were addicted. So Candace really came to this whole study with a pure heart, thinking she was going to help people. She never could have imagined the nightmare she'd set in motion. So that's sort of, and we can dive deeper into that later, but that was sort of one of her major accomplishments. Another one was, as you said, discovering Peptide T, or creating Peptide T, which was the underground AIDS drug featured in Dallas Buyers Club. And I will say that part of that script, there's a lot that it got wrong. But because before, the Ron Woodruff character, the Matthew McConaughey character, was getting it from a cheaper source in Mexico, he was actually getting it direct from the source, from Candace Pert. So then there's like a Breaking Bad aspect to her story, that she was sort of like funneling drugs to the AIDS underground. And then the last sort of big, her major accomplishment, which I think stands the test of time so much, again, was she's the mother of the mind-body revolution. She was really the first person saying, proving in the early 1980s, that the brain is not the control center of the body as was previously believed, but rather works in concert with our immune system, our gastrointestinal system, our central nervous system, to shape our thoughts and emotions, like really to create our reality. It's not just like our body exists to hold up our head, and our head is this, has a logical roadmap that we follow. It's, what Candace said was, if the body and brain are one, existing simultaneously, then they should be addressed and assessed holistically and really treated as such. But the Western medical system at the time, and somewhat still today, was set up in a very silo-based way. Virologists were looking to eradicate disease, but they weren't thinking about how disease manifested in the first place. She was the first person who was saying things like stress can cause disease.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, really, as I matured through my career, things were specialized. You learned about this organ or this particular body system, and there was no holistic thing. Over the decades, I've come to, as a therapist, we are embodied minds,
Yeah.
and our bodies, and this is part of what mind control is it dissociates us from our body. And that's why so many people born or raised or in long-term mind control cults have autoimmune dysfunctions and diseases because they're not in their body, listening to their body. And as you correctly said, body keeps the score. So
Yeah.
millions of copies, and people are like, whoa, we really need to be in our bodies and do somatic oriented therapy. And it's like, yes, that's right. And not only that, we're biopsychosocial beings. We need community. We need other humans, not digital avatars and digital space, like real people. And this morning, as we're recording this, the New York Times, I believe, had an article on the power of hugs and the importance of
Oh,
massage in lowering stress and cortisol and all these other things. It's like, yes, we're humans, we're in our bodies. It's really important.
it
But
is. I,
let's go back to this woman because she was. Oh, and I wanted to mention, did you see Lessons in Chemistry?
I did, and that's sort of one of my other comps as I now think about it. I mean, there were so many parallels there to Candace's story
I
too,
thought it may
and
have been like stolen from
I
Candace's
know.
story after I learned about Candace. It's about this
I mean,
brilliant chemist, and the guys wanted to co-opt her research, and she was
completely.
like, "No, this is my stuff," and
That's exactly right. And Candace was sharp elbowed and she was a tough broad, but she really was doing this groundbreaking interdisciplinary work. To your previous point, she was saying that, the NIH, well, actually, this is sort of a fun story that I learned through my research about how, Candace was overturning the defining paradigm that had basically characterized Western medicine for 400 years, since the 1600s. And the story
mm-hmm.
behind this is so wild and kooky. It was the fact that, in the 1600s, Descartes wanted to autopsy bodies. He wanted to dissect bodies to figure out how we worked inside. And he was not allowed to do that because autopsy was considered a desecration by the Catholic Church. So Descartes appealed to the Pope and made a deal where they said, okay, if we can agree that above the neck, here, this is the part of the body that holds man's inherent sacredness, and everything below is kind of a meat sack, then okay, you're free to, you're free to cut up human
Wow.
bodies. Like, once the soul has departed, you can dissect bodies. And that, from that agreement, which was not scientifically based, of course, many scientific leaps have been, the ability to dissect the human body to understand how our systems work was very valuable. But no one ever questioned it for 400 years until
Mm.
Candace started doing this work and saying, hold on a second, this actually isn't true. It doesn't make sense. And we
Mm-hmm.
actually, but by then, the NIH and academic systems had been set up in this very silo-based way, and their funding was very silo-based. So when you got a grant to look at one system. And again, virologists weren't thinking about how cancer, how the body manifested cancer. They were just thinking about how to eradicate it. So Candace, basically, by proving the mind-body link and suggesting that we should basically overhaul the way we look at Western medicine. She was ruffling feathers extraordinaire. She wasn't just, pushing the bound of her field. She was saying, wait, we've got it all wrong. We need to rethink the entire paradigm. So
Right.
and she was stepping on a lot of toes, because she was actually, these mostly men. And again, I have 3 sons. I love men, but, there was mostly men who she called the body boys, were, because she was a renowned neuroscientist and psychopharmacologist, but people who were studying, the various parts of the body really didn't want this tough, sharp-elbowed, insistent lady coming in and infringing upon their turf. They didn't take kindly to that, like her wanting to. It was a land grab. They didn't want her taking their funds and things like that. So it was. She was up against a lot of forces.
Yeah, egos can be really problematic, and What I love are people who are dedicated, as you were saying, mission driven, purpose driven, like to help the world, to help other people and just advance knowledge. And I just want to do a shout out to Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist who
Yes,
wrote Think Again. He started the book with Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for thinking fast and slow, recently passed away. Brilliant mind. And
brilliant.
and he opens the book and he's talking to Kahneman saying, you know, one of your theories was wrong. What do you think? And he's like, I'm delighted. And how can you react that way? You know, it's because I don't care about my ego. I just want to help science to progress. So the whole point of the book is separate your ego from your beliefs and pursue truth. Pursue
Yeah.
an open-endedness of, I may not know. I believe this is true, but maybe there's a better explanation for reality. And then we can learn and grow.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And part of what I found that was disheartening in my research is that, even with the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, it's not always, a lot of the systems that we have built, both in academia and in our government funded medicine at the NIH, are not really built on sort of public good. They are frighteningly so. Driven by large egos who put corporate profits and personal aspirations and achievement ahead of public good. And I know that that's a really harsh statement to make, but that is sort of one of the overwhelming discoveries that came from this book. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Candace, as I sort of talk about the evolution of Candace's character from sort of a very starry eyed, excited, passionate, thrilled bench scientist to someone who sort of really did explore the dark side of herself and her capabilities. I look at the systems that help shape her and really how
Yes.
she got there, because none of this happens in a vacuum. People's
Yes.
characters, and this whole podcast and about cults, it's sort of what shapes character, how are
Yeah.
we defined not only internally, but also by our external systems and by the sort of dysfunctional systems sometimes that reward greed and self-interest.
Yeah. So I guess I want to comment, if I may. So she was 26 when she discovered the opioid receptor, wanting to help vets who are addicted to heroin and come up with a solution. And then the pharmaceutical industry, co opted, I guess, her mentor and her research to, like, how can we use this to sell more drugs or sell more
Yeah,
medications, right? And I just want to make the meta point, which you've been, touching on, and that is whatever has the power to help has the power to be abused. And we
yeah,
have the Oxycontin, contin, and the whole opioid addiction crisis from this research, even though its intention is for goodness.
a
And now
hundred
we
percent.
face a
I mean,
parallel with technology and AI and
that
everything. It can be used for good and it can be used for evil. And who's doing the guardrails and who's monitoring the checks and balances to prevent abuse of power by bad actors?
yeah.
And that's the moment we live in right now.
it, it's a huge consideration, and again, I think studying this story, the number of instances that I can point to just in Candace's life alone where she came up against these sort of make or break moments, not only in her personal life but also sort of in history, um, is fascinating. So let's dive into the opiate receptor for a second and talk about sort of
Please.
what went wrong. Because I kept thinking about, okay, what can we learn from this? Like, because this is a cautionary tale. Um, so Candace, most people think that the opioid crisis started in the 90s with, pharmaceutical companies, but really it didn't. As you said, it started in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon declared war on drugs. And then here's where it gets interesting. Why did Richard Nixon declare war on drugs? Not because he was so fascinated by, or I think that, well, I shouldn't ascribe, intentions to Richard Nixon. But my external observations are that he probably wouldn't have cared so much about curing addiction if he didn't want to, if he wasn't committed to escalating bombing in Vietnam at a time when the war had become increasingly unpopular among American citizens. So what was happening over there is that 25% of soldiers, American soldiers fighting in Vietnam, were addicted to a form of heroin that was 95% pure. Like street heroin here is like 5% pure. So our soldiers were completely whacked out on drugs, and a lot of their horrific behavior and things like the My Lai massacre, where civilians massacred, was being blamed on this epidemic of drug addiction. And so Nixon figured, okay, if I can, it's like, oh, don't look over there, look over here. If I can take credit, my administration can take credit for eradicating drug addiction, for finding a cure, then we can sort of do what we want over there. It was a PR move. And so Nixon was one of the first presidents to pour millions of dollars into science. Simultaneously, no one in science had been interested in drug addiction. There was a very small coterie of scientists. It was called the Opiate Club, who were sort of quietly looking into addiction, but not a splashy topic at all, not something that was going to get you any sort of notoriety, until Nixon poured all the money in. And where there is money, like, you follow the money, then you follow the power and the self-interest and all that stuff. Again, I think self-interest is great because it can have incredible, it can be great because it can have wonderful impact on society regardless, but you have to look at how these forces come into play. So what ended up happening was then more of a land grab. People come in, they want the money. It becomes a sexy area of interest. So Candace Pert was, again, like you said, a 26-year-old graduate student at Johns Hopkins. She was, again, starry-eyed, completely revered her mentor, Solomon Snyder, who was the youngest, at age 31, the youngest tenured professor at Johns Hopkins. He himself, and speaking of, this is something we can talk about after, the sort of cult-like nature of the scientific establishment. But part of what I learned in my research is how science is modeled after it's like the apprenticeship model, like in architects or artists or things like that. And so your one scientific lineage is extraordinarily important. And so Candace realized in joining Sol Snyder's lab, his mentor had been a Nobel Prize winner, Julius Axelrod. Julius's mentor had been Steve Brody, who is the veritable father of pharmacology. He was the first person who started to look at how drugs interact and form chemical, to elicit chemical reactions in our bodies. So this was a royal scientific lineage that she was joining. And interestingly, statistically, 50% of all Nobel Prize winners are descended from other Nobel Prize winners. Is that because they're so great at spotting genius? Or is it because they're really great at promoting their own people and sort of securing their own lineage by sort of working the systems of power to make sure that people are brought up and shine? Again,
networks.
all valuable. Yeah, networks are powerful and valuable in science, especially in an area where no one is making big money. All you have is publish or perish. You have the respect and acknowledgement of your peers. There's a ton of emphasis on, because money isn't an issue, it's reputation and it's notoriety and it's awards. So Candace joins this group. She says to Sol, I don't want to do this boring acetylcholine essay that you've assigned me. I want to take on one of the pressing issues of the day. In the way of my scientific lineage, I want to practice hot science. I want to find the opiate receptor. And he kind of rolls his eyes and says, you know what? All right, the odds are low, but fine. They work on this for 6 months. She fails to find it. And he pulls the plug. He says, you know what? Come on. I've got to make sure you get your degree. I'm your boss. Like, enough of this wild goose chase. Because by this point, scientists the world over had gotten a whole bunch of press. And so, again, people far senior and more important than Candace had jumped in the fray. Well, Candace, being Candace, because she was an impulsive wild child, illegally procures radioactive material from her husband, who was a scientist working elsewhere, sneaks into the lab with her, 4-year-old son in tow, gives him a bunch of, lab equipment or whatever to play with on the floor, and does what scientists the world over are trying to do. I mean, again, this was before computers, so she had to wait on pins. She did it on a Friday night when everyone had gone home, waited on pins and needles, shows up Monday morning, and eureka, she's done it. Like, she's found it. And so she went again quickly from zero to hero, from not known at all to sort of in the spotlight with Saul, because she co-authored these papers that she wrote um, with Saul. And it turns out that she not only found the opiate receptor, but the technique that she pioneered to enable that also enabled the location of every other receptor, like the, cannabis receptor, all
Right, because
nicotine
it was
receptor.
using radioactive materials to see where in the brain it was traveling, and right.
Exactly. And in,
Hmm.
and in the body, because,
Yeah.
and again, I was not an expert in sort of, receptors and internal or external drugs, but to give, listeners an idea, I mean, this is sort of a rudimentary explanation, but receptors, there are thousands of, receptors exist on the surface of cells, and they exist. They didn't just evolve for exogenous or, external drugs. Like, we don't have an opiate receptor because of heroin. Our body has to have an internal chemical that fits into that, like a lock and a key, they say, in order to sort of launch chemical reactions. Well, 3 years later, scientists at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland discovered our body's internal high, endorphins, which means endogenous morphine.
Right.
And then, to your point, initially, so pharmaceutical companies tried to create an endorphin mimetic. They tried to create something that would be a non-addictive painkiller based on
Right.
our own high, that could help prevent drug addiction, and they couldn't do it. So
Right.
what happened when they failed? They decided, okay, we're not going to make a mint off this, so why don't we just create more potent analgesics?
Right.
And and that's how I mean, and we can go into sort of how the role that the FDA played and the government played in sort of allowing what happened over the subsequent 40 years. But the desperately tragic part of this is, I say that Candace was in finding this and creating this technique, like the Pandora, who opened the box to the drug revolution, and then she became like the Cassandra, who was looking at what pharmaceutical company, like, again, like the creative nuclear fission, like you have Oppenheimer, who came to hate the bomb.
Right.
This was Candace. She was warning that hold on a second, why have we become trigger happy with regard to
Right.
prescription drugs? Look how you are lining corporate profits while ravaging a population desperate for relief. How did this happen?
Right. I could go in so many different directions, but
I
I feel like I should say for our younger audience, because I was born in 54 and I have two older sisters, that I lived through the 60s when women's liberation was like a radical new concept, right? Where women should have equal rights. I remember one of my first girlfriends was yelling at me because I opened the door for her. It's like, I can open my own door. But this was the window where she was like, I want to do what I want to do, and the heck with these guys and the old boy network, and let me understand the game, and let me outsmart them.
Yeah,
And in many ways she did do that, but then she kind of got corrupted, or she got into the shadow side of human nature and such. And I don't know if we're ready to get into some of those stories, but that's part of we have idols, who are achieving genius and great things, and they also have a shadow side and do stuff that
yeah.
is unsavory.
It's true. And part of what I discovered too, I mean, again, just to go back for a second to sort of my journey into Candace. So after I published my first book, Stiletto Network, that book got optioned, and I ended up doing, and that was sort of my way into, both writing and producing. And I just loved the work. I didn't mean to pivot from journalism, but these were all these exciting new opportunities. So I was interested in sort of mind body connection stuff, and I wanted to understand the science behind it because now, I mean, it's everywhere, right? There are all the sort of, peak performance bros and all the stuff, and they're taught. And so I wanted to understand, okay, how does this all really work? And someone referred me to her 1997 memoir, Molecules of Emotion.
Mm.
So I read that book and was absolutely fascinated. I was like, this is a film. This was when it came. So I reached out to her widower to get the rights to her book. But I said, hold on a second. It was published in 97. She died in 2013. How does her story end? And of course, like memoirists, when you're writing your own story, you're going to present yourself. I mean, she did acknowledge her foibles and the dog eat dog culture in which she was raised in the scientific establishment, but not the half of it. So what I ended up doing was at first it was a quest to find the last 30 pages of her script that then became a
Mm.
7-year obsession to really say, oh my God, what happened to this woman and why? In the book, I have a sentence, something like, you know, what happens when rules are broken and standards break down? What happens when the very institutions charged with upholding public health are to their very core rank with sickness? What
Mm.
turns a good woman bad? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that became my quest to understand not just what became of Candace, but like you said, what are the systems that shaped her, and what can we do about it to, the American medical system to make the world a better place, hopefully.
Right.
Because I think that's what Candace really wanted to do initially,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
just got corrupted. And
And yeah, so I mean, we've
yeah,
chatted before this interview, but she had some cult infiltration into her mind, and to her detriment, everything I can tell.
yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting lens with which to view her story because it really is. I mean, having being familiar with your work and listening to your podcast, it's so and your history, it's fascinating to see how cultures develop within institutions and use these elements of manipulation. And I mean, it sounds so strong to say mind control, but really, when you are a young person sort of indoctrinated into something like, again, a scientific lineage, and you're told that, this is a royal family and you have to follow the culture, and then add to that, you are a minority, right? So there are certain characteristics, and again, you pointed to what this is the women's movement, but still, there weren't words like today, like empathy and compassion being associated with leadership at that time. Like that was
Right.
anathema to what leaders
Right.
were tough, they were strong, they did what it needed to get done, they screwed each other. And in science, when I was I was actually learning that it was pretty common to steal each other's data to sort of try to trump somebody else, to in again, what they say about academia sometimes is the knives are so sharp because the stakes are so low. Like, what are you fighting over? $3?
Hmm.
Like, it's same thing in journalism. You're
Hmm.
fighting over $1 a word, right?
Hmm.
But when everybody in an atmosphere of scarcity, when there's only room for sort of one person to succeed or one person to get a $10,000 grant you find these environments where people are pit against each other
Yeah.
and really behave in very antisocial ways.
Yeah.
And there are analogies to sort of cults in that.
Yep.
Because what they do is they glorify one leader. Like again, if you are the Nobel Prize winner, you suddenly have access to all the money and all the grants and all the students you want. There aren't, I think in science, like I think that there could be better checks and balances
Sure.
on power. And one thing, Naomi Oreskes wrote a beautiful book called Why Trust Science. And she talks about how science is built on consensus over time. And yet I've also, where people believe one thing, and like Daniel Kahneman said, okay,
Right.
so then he can be proven wrong. And in an ideal world, people would just sort of say, what a wonderful thing. Like that
Right.
someone stood on my shoulders and they built something even better. But what really happens is what they say in science is that science proceeds one funeral at a time, and
Hmm.
that actually only, even in the face of conflicting evidence, people who've built their whole careers, particularly if they've been publicly lauded for a discovery, the last thing they want is to have that to be dethroned, or
Yep.
defrocked.
Yep.
They will hold on. There are so many examples in science of people holding on white knuckled to a belief in the face of it, and becomes a belief. Then you're questioning, like, is it science or is it religion? Because if science is supposed to be fact based and all the facts point to something else, but you insist that you were right, well, that's not really, it's only when you die, one funeral at a time, that your ideas are then supplanted by another school of thought.
Yeah.
Especially especially if you're the king.
Yeah, and a lot of brilliant people's work were not discovered until way after they died, in poetry and literature and many, many different fields. But, I think that part of the problem, as you were discussing, is the institutions, our educational institutions where we're pitted against each other and we're graded and we're competing for a small number of slots in grad school instead of a cooperative learning system, which is proven to be far more engaging and successful, and people love to teach. And it's the best way to learn is to teach, not memorize for a standardized test. We have to really have a revolution in human consciousness and in learning to really realize, what? The old ways suck.
Yeah.
If I can cut to the chase.
No,
They just suck.
I could not. They suck. No, honestly, I couldn't agree more. And again, this also came when I was studying Candace. I was also studying. With my previous book with Stiletto Network, I had been looking at the whole history of women in the workforce. And while I was writing that book that was about women's networks, and I was, I sort of jokingly called it a love story disguised as a business story, because it was about women in the world developing networks of mutual support who actually really, I charted billions of dollars of transactions, but the relationships at the heart of these groups were not transactional. They were true friendships. And yet I was going out and trotting out that thesis and being told all of the counter stories about, like, that bitch I worked for, I'll never work. And these are women. I'll never work for a woman again. It was the worst. She cut me down. She stole my work. She undermined me. So I tried to, and it was interesting because you hear the same stories of minorities, what they will say about minority bosses. Not everyone, but there were enough where I heard stories where I just said, I don't believe that there's any one group that is actually bad at all, right? We're all human beings, but I wanted to understand the systemic pressures. Like, what are the systems that cause people to behave in certain ways? And what I found, and this was certainly true for Candace too, that in systems, and again, most of our systems, and God bless white men, because, like, that doesn't mean white men are bad, that they built systems for themselves that work for white men, right? It just meant they were doing what was good for them, right? But suddenly you start to integrate women or people of color into those systems that were really never built for them or to be hospitable to them. And you really find that in systems, generally, there was only room for one woman or person of color at the top of any particular department, if not company or entire industry, right? It was sort of a singular. And what does that mean? It means if you're a woman, you can't share information and resources with the gal in the office next to you because it's you or me, not you and me. Right. And you can't mentor that bright up and comer or sponsor her, God forbid, because she's going to knock you off your perch, right? Like these like women and people of color in many situations were even more pit against each other. For men, it was I scratch your back, you scratch mine, because 20 of us are making partner together. We're playing the long game, right? But for women, and a number of Candace's colleagues, female colleagues, say, oh, okay, when Candace had a brouhaha with her male mentor, who then tried to take credit for the opiate receptor, she sort of came out in, charging as a feminist, women stick together. But actually, she had been quite brutal with her female colleagues and stolen work. And she was actually, this whole story of Candace as sort of, she's a victim, but she's also a perpetrator throughout the
Mm,
whole book. And I think
mm,
that this is, for many successful people, I think those leadership qualities that are absolutely prized in men, he screams at his staff, but he does what needs to be done. He has to be tough to succeed.
right.
Suddenly they become, when adopted by women and people of color, become a poison pill, because then you're
Yeah.
like a crazy bitch, right?
Right. But I think, I don't know, I'm biased. I'm a white guy, but I kind of feel like she modeled white male behavior and was like, this is the nature of how power is. And therefore, I'm going to play the game and learn their rules and do it that way. And
She did.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
And so, but that, yeah, but is that so? So then here's the issue though, right? Like when women do that, they're kind of, because I will say Candace's, there are a whole bunch of Candace's colleagues. The most salient example, at least in the book, is Bob Gallo, who was a big wig at the National Cancer Institute at the time, who caused an international incident by claiming that he had discovered that HIV was the root cause of AIDS. And then it came out after that he had basically stolen that from from scientists at the Pasteur Institute in France, requiring both countries' presidents to get involved to settle this, renaming the disease. The French had called it lab. I mean, it was full. Bob Gallo then went on to become sponsored. He founded the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland. He was sort of what my sources say, is that he was counseled out of the NIH. He would
hmm,
never admit, he doesn't admit to that. But Pulitzer Prize winner, John Crutzen, who was a Chicago Tribune writer, wrote an
mm-hmm,
entire book like on Gallo's, many books all over the, like, on Gallo's misdeeds, and he is now sort of continues to be lauded in his 80s, whereas
wow,
Candace was burned at the stake. And you kind of have to say, like, the standards are different, for or maybe were and potentially still are for women.
right.
But the
So I want to,
systems do shape you.
yes. So we're doing this interview in 2024. I'm going to put you on the spot. So if you're
Yeah.
talking to young girls who are thinking about journalism or going into sciences, STEM, like, of all the things you've learned, what advice might you offer to young girls and women?
Entrepreneurship is the door to the palace, I will say, because in Stiletto Network, one of my wonderful sources, who was started out in sort of a big management consulting firm, I think, out of college, but then quickly became an entrepreneur and ended up founding multiple companies, interestingly, with her husband and her brother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Said to me, "There's only a glass ceiling if you live in the house that's built."
Mm,
Why now? I think actually there are enough female entrepreneurs, female funded and founded companies, that you can really join cultures that are immediately welcoming to you. But for our female forebears, I mean, I am going to turn 50 this year. And so I am sort of in the middle of the continuum of women's history. And I have to say, studying Stiletto Network made me feel so much compassion and respect for the women who came before, because
mm,
women couldn't get a line of credit. They couldn't get credit cards until 1974. It's not like you could just start your own business,
right.
easily. And so there was no choice for a woman who was ambitious and wanted to work, but to enter these systems that really were inhospitable in many ways. And
Yeah.
so I think now, and not everybody has an entrepreneur, is an entrepreneur. I think that entrepreneurs are largely made, born, not made. But I would be really careful to join a company that has an equal number of male and female executives at all ranks, and I
Mm,
would say the same thing for, and a colorful assortment as well,
mm-hmm.
because you want to be in situations where you're set up to succeed, not where it's constantly a fight. I think
Mm-hmm.
where Candace, there are also the issues of Candace's emotional and mental health. And I do ask the question, does the gaslighting that she and sabotage and undermining that she withstood throughout her career, was she born this way, or was Candace Pert driven insane? You have to sort of
Mm.
say, if everyone at every, and again, this is sort of ties it back into the cult stuff. If you have people all around you, if your internal compass tells you that something is true, if you have a gut feeling, which we know is also like our microbiome working with our brain, giving us really
Yeah,
important
there are
intelligence.
neurons down there for sure.
Yeah. And you consistently ignore that because you're being told, like, oh, I say it's white. No, it's black. No, you're wrong. And you're surrounded by people in this echo chamber. How do you, and you feel constantly out of sorts? What happens to a person in that situation?
Yeah, they go crazy. I actually am friends
Yeah.
with Robert Stern of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, who wrote the Gaslight Effect and the workbook. And gaslighting and mind control are directly related. It's really, except gaslighting is typically 1-to-1, although Trump did a very good job of gaslighting the country and the world.
God bless.
But, like other malignant narcissists. But the critical thing that I want to keep coming back to is we really need to listen to our bodies and listen to our intuition and our conscience and stay clear with our values and not be corrupted by external forces, whether it be power, money, sex, whatever forces are happening. Because in the end, you need to look in the mirror and be at peace with yourself about your decisions,
It's true. I mean,
and yeah,
yeah, I mean, I mean, that's actually such a perfect segue to the next chapter of Candace's story, too, with
please,
Peptide T. I was like, oh, okay, because
please.
I, it's interesting because what happened, again, Candace is this gateway to talk about these big political movements. And the next big movement in which she was involved was the AIDS crisis. And so, I mean, without the politics around this are fascinating, but the headline here is that the nation was suffering from another whole epidemic, which was prejudice. I mean, the HIV has an average incubation of 5.5 years, and it was allowed to spread unabated in just rampant ways, because scientists found it distasteful, because nobody liked gay men, because curing gay cancer was not a sexy disease, and because the Reagan administration cut funding and
Yeah,
had already cut funding to sort of academic medical centers and the NIH. And even though Reagan was saying that this was his number one health priority, there was no money going. Like, the
right,
rhetoric did not match the money.
right.
And so, and it wasn't until actually finally he assented after many years where where actually other people sounding the alarm, saying this is a huge crisis because it had infected, through blood transfusions,
Right,
heterosexual populations and children,
right.
that actually the government poured money into this. Suddenly, same thing as the opiate land grab, money, power, the potential for the Nobel Prize became a land grab. So
Yeah.
there were all of these factions at the NIH fighting for power. One was Bob Gallo at the National Cancer Institute. They'd sort of, they were had started studying it first. The other was a very young administrator at the time, Tony Fauci. I've been hearing about Tony Fauci for years before COVID because he was a
Mm,
contemporary to Candace. They had both won federal awards for like top 40 under 40 scientists together. They knew each other,
mm,
and they were rising stars. And at age 43, Tony Fauci was the youngest person ever to lead an institute at the NIH. So
mm-hmm.
he was a rising star, but by far not the most powerful guy in the room.
Right.
And then you have, again, Candace Pert was working at the National Institute of Mental Health in pharmacology. So, in a silo based system, do the body boys, as she called them, want her coming in and infringing on their turf? No, they do not. But because she got a call from a guy at the National Cancer Institute who said, we see AIDS, we're seeing symptoms of dementia actually, infecting, somehow this disease is piercing the blood-brain barrier. There's a mental component to it. We have actually, again, because in Western science at the time, the head was separate from the body.
Right.
So there's no way this disease with all of its complex symptoms and like, how could it be in the head? And so she sort of saw this, and virologists didn't even believe there was a connection in the first place. So
Mm.
she saw this trail that she alone could blaze because she's like, I'm going to figure out how AIDS infects the brain and do the same thing I did with the opiate receptor, figure out with endorphins. Let me see if I can find some sort of a mimetic for the disease that will plug the receptor and stop the disease from getting in. The idea was just to close the door on the receptor so that the disease wouldn't find a home and would eventually sort of die out in the body. And it
Yeah.
was a holistic approach. It wasn't like, let's bomb the system with a chemo derivative that
Right.
was AZT, which is the only drug on the market at the time.
Right.
Candace faced just a remarkable amount of resistance, and there weren't the same biotech laws as there are now. Fauci was running the 19-member committee that decided which AIDS drugs would move forward to clinical trials. And despite showing that Peptide T worked, in a number, Candace was set up to go to clinical trials, and then suddenly her enemies, basically at the NIH, came swooping in. And why? Because many of them had financial interests in competing drugs. They already had deals with pharmaceutical companies, a number of guys at Harvard. This was another, just incredible journalistic work at the time that I dove into, but trying to figure out, okay, if you follow the money in science, you're going to understand how things get done.
Follow
And
the money in
Fauci-
anything is journalists' rule, right? Sorry.
Right.
Keep
No,
going.
but you're 100%. And so basically, Bob Gallo at the National Cancer Institute was best buddies with Bill Hazeltine, who was at Harvard. And so, I chart in the book how many boards and editor of scientific journals they were greasing the wheels. It was three different guys, Hazeltine, Essex, and Gallo, this triumvirate, who were trying to control. They were all trying to get the Nobel Prize. They were all trying to control. It wasn't how many people can we help. It was, how can we get credit for?
Right.
And so they all ended up getting, or at least Hazeltine and Essex ended up with multi-million-dollar deals with pharmaceutical companies, and they got very, very wealthy for a drug that did not work at all. But in the process, they had to squash people like Candace, like their competition, because it was a zero-sum game. And if she won, then they lost. So they didn't want any resources or sort of any lights being shined on her. And her drug was going to be less lucrative because it was more natural. So it was less, there would be less profit for pharmaceutical companies. And nobody liked that either, because some of that money funnels back into government institutions.
Yeah.
And so there was a massive land grab, and in the process, and here's a question, did Candace go bad, or did she actually do the right thing? Because all around her, she was seeing these poor men whose bodies were just being who were losing all their dignity before they actually lost their lives. And she was desperate to help. She also had a healthy ego of her own and was like, I'll screw you. I'll show you to these competitors. Right. So she started here's where the Dallas Buyers Club script goes wrong. She started disseminating Peptide T, making it in her federal lab at the NIH, a government employee, was like dealing drugs and then disseminating it with her sister and her husband on the underground with AIDS activists, working with the leaders of ACT UP, with the Provincetown Positives, not only, to sort of test the efficacy, but also to gather data so that because the activists themselves were becoming increasingly powerful, and then they could go back to Fauci and other government representatives and rattle the cage and say, we want this stuff. So it was a symbiotic relationship. But then you sort of say, hold on, these systems, like none of the systems are working.
Right. I could go in so many different directions. I have a dear friend, Kurt Reynolds, who had AIDS and was just, his art was recognized at the Museum of Fine Arts because he was involved with ACT UP and this underground, activism thing. But I guess I also want to just take a minute to connect the dots between the AIDS and the COVID, where there were these right-wing ministers saying this is a plague on
Oh
gay
my God.
people. It's, this is God's judgment. So there was that whole religious phobia crap that's a parallel, and that praying it away, if you were pure, and you surrendered, then it would be cured. And no, this is like a real disease, and we need science.
This was like crazy town. So I was doing my primary research and reading all of these articles. And actually, God bless Candace's sister, Wynn, who worked with her, because Wynn was kind of, she was OCD and she had other issues. But part of that was she kept records of every single thing. So I became the recipient of all of these articles that I don't even think you could find on like microfiche, and because a lot of
Wow.
the publications, they were sort of temporary publications just to the AIDS community. But it was, I mean,
Mm,
everything from New York Times, Washington Post, to, leaflets. But
mm,
she kept all the letters between Candace and Fauci's committee. She felt, I mean, it was really just a research
cool.
goldmine for me that I was so grateful for. However, this was like right in the heart of 2020. So I'm doing all of this research and then simultaneously watching the news, reading, my local paper, which is the New York Times, for which I used to write, going, oh my gosh, it was almost like if you had substituted AIDS for COVID in
Yeah.
either one of these articles, it could have been, it was the same thing. They both said it could be cured by Clorox. It both said that, it could spread from, any contact. I mean, in 1983, Fauci actually, there was a smackdown on Fauci because he was the administrator who said that AIDS could be spread through. They thought AIDS could be spread through natural daily contact. So
Mm,
people just lost it. I mean, he said later that the media had taken his words out of context, but actually, if you look at that's what he was saying.
yeah.
And so, of course, because they were noting mother to child transmission. And so they thought it could be just sort of, oh, you touched something on the counter or I
Right.
sneezed on you, not
Right.
through the blood, not
Instead
through
of
the,
saying
like,
we don't know, it could be
instead of saying
anything.
we don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another
There was
problem
so
when you
much
have
false
an ego.
information.
You
Yeah. There was
try to make it
so much
sound
false information.
right.
Yeah.
But in the end, this woman's work really deserves to be remembered and lauded. But as you were saying, she also got corrupted, I guess would be a term, by bad forces. I don't know. How would
She
you
did.
describe?
I say again that Candace was in so many ways in her life, both a victim and a perpetrator. She
Mm,
had bad things, and again, it's a trite way to say it, but like, when they say like hurt people,
mm,
she was indoctrinated into systems that actually, really promoted some pretty dysfunctional values of, backbiting and stealing and, any winning at all costs, both
mm,
at Johns Hopkins and at the NIH. She was steeped in these systems that where, and again, her white male colleagues were being consistently rewarded for this
mm-hmm,
behavior. And even when it was exposed, the powers that be were sort of hiding it as long as it sort of shed, as long as it shined a positive light overall on the institution, like Bob Gallo. The Reagan administration protected him.
mm,
It was a win for Gallo, was a win for America. Americans discovered the cause of AIDS.
mm,
No, we didn't. But the Reagan administration got behind this. He was a direct colleague of Candace's. She was seeing this happen right and left. And then
mm,
she went and she did the same thing. And
mm,
ultimately, was accused and with her second husband of defrauding investors, as sort of after she left the NIH and died in a certain amount of ignominy. But I think
mm,
she, even at the end of her life, many people believed that she was going to come clean, that there
mm,
was going to be sort of a redemption story. And I think, again, like you said, I think that she did get corrupted, but I think part of her always, she knew, like she knew what she had done wrong. And so she was, I think honestly, she was diagnosed as bipolar. But I think
I was
part of
going to
that
ask
is,
you, is there an official diagnosis of that?
yeah. Well, she had her first psychotic break when she was a freshman in college. She originally started out at Wheaton College, got a full scholarship, and in her freshman year, her first semester, basically, what she says in her memoir, which is really, not true, is that she had like an endocrine imbalance or something after subsisting on a diet of peach pie. But really, I mean, diagnoses were also not as rigorous, or people didn't understand so much about mental health. She had a nervous breakdown, is
But didn't
essentially
she
that
go
she
to
was.
Est? Am I
She
misremembering
did.
or land?
Oh yes, she did. So
Because
that was,
people had
and
psychotic
that was her.
breakdowns from Werner Erhard, Jack Rosenberg, you know.
That was her second psychotic. That precipitated her second. So she had a predisposition. I mean, again, her father, looking back, many people said, undiagnosed, but all the symptoms of bipolar disorder as well.
Mm.
Her sister fully diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Oh,
Um, Candace, according to her first husband, also a scientist, was diagnosed. And in part, what happened, exactly as you said, she had this one breakdown, and then was largely, according to her colleagues, who are mental health professionals, was hypomanic. Existed for periods of 7 to 8 years at a time. In a state of she was wackadoodle and super high, and but she was profoundly productive, and this
yeah,
was her flights of genius. This is
yeah.
why she didn't want to take drugs, because it blunted her extreme creativity, her sexual appetites, all this stuff. But it was when she took Est, she went to that, and Agu, her first husband, said that she came home and was crawling on the floor and completely hallucinating and claiming he was the devil. And and he turned to Saul Snyder, who was her mentor, who had betrayed her, but was also one of the leading mental health professionals of his day. And they had Candace was committed for 3 weeks, and then on like very, very strong drugs for another number of months after that, and
Hmm.
depressed. I mean, she seemed to be suffering a full cycle of bipolar, but brought on by Est.
Yeah. So I just want to mention I interviewed a South African PhD researcher who is bipolar, who was ordered to go to, I guess it was Landmark Forum, which was the newer version
Yeah,
of S. And because he was bipolar, he could watch people, and he's like, they're creating an environment for bipolarity by the
yeah.
stress, by the pressure, by the controls, etc. So he did a whole thesis on the dopaminergic activity. It's fascinating stuff.
Well,
But
they deprive you of sleep. They, deprive you of food. I mean, it's really, and interestingly, even in her memoir, like in so many ways in her memoir, she sort of glossed over her own culpability in certain things. And
mm,
with regard the way she talks about Est, she sort of says that it was, a moment of spiritual transformation where she realized God is in the frontal cortex, and she had a spiritual awakening. And again, I think, I am a spiritual person. I don't actually, and Candace is part of, even though spirit and soul are words that are right now like anathema in science, my dear friend Lisa Miller is at the forefront at Columbia University studying the science of spirituality. And there are a whole hundreds of years of incredible scientists who have credited their great breakthroughs, like, Dmitry Mendeleev, the periodic table, he dreamt it. I mean, to the hand of the divine. So who am I to criticize that? However, when you look at what happened to Candace, I'm not gonna say that you can't have a spiritual epiphany. What I will say is that what happened to Candace afterward was just remarkably destructive. There and after was remarkably destructive to her
yep,
family, to her marriage. I mean, and it actually precipitated, I mean, because the heavy course of drugs that she was prescribed, she became, again, it was so tragic because she was developing these drugs and then coming to hate them,
yeah,
because she was developing drugs to treat like all types of psychiatric disorders,
right.
and then became the person who needed them and despised them. And so
Hmm.
it is a sad story.
Yeah. So, because I've counseled so many people who went to EST and Landmark, they hypnotically indoctrinate people to believe that you are God and you create your own reality. And there's no such thing as a victim. So if you got raped as a 5-year-old, your spirit created that experience for you. But it was a perfect setup that ex-members could never accuse them of mind controlling them because there are no victims, but you don't understand what was put inside of your head. It's so destructive.
Yeah.
And yet a lot of people take the initial training, never go on, and they had a good experience. It was like a
Yeah.
jolt to get their
But it
life
does
going.
feel like they also prey upon really, people at very fragile points in their lives.
Definitely.
I wouldn't say, I mean, when Candace went to Est, it was right after she weathered, um, you know, profound public disgrace. She had, for speaking out, when her mentor, Saul
Mm,
Snyder, tried to take credit for her discovery of the opiate receptor, he won the Lasker Award for
mm,
her work. She found out afterward, that he had paired up because this was, he was everybody said that all my sources basically said that who worked in his lab, that he was dying in his scientific lineage to also win the Nobel Prize. And
mm.
even though he had pulled the plug on Candace's work, he played an instrumental part in it. They should have won it together. But the
Yes.
reality is, only three people can be awarded the Nobel Prize. And so there was a duo at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland who discovered endorphins, our body's endogenous morphine, right, our
Right.
internal high, 3 years after the opiate receptor. There were two of them. They were both men. And then there was Candace and Saul. Okay, who are you going to cut out? Who's the easiest one to the pin to drop? It's the youngest and the woman.
Yeah.
So Saul purposefully cut Candace out. Candace found out and was devastated. She loved this man like a father
Sure.
or brother. She did everything for him. She was like his minion. She
Yeah.
served him, and people say that he created a Frankenstein's monster in her, because
Mm.
until she served him and did his bidding, and some lousy things they did together, like cutting other people's research out of the work so they could claim the whole
Mm.
thing.
Mm.
They, and she spoke out, but she then got branded the Scarlet Woman of neuroscience. So
Mm.
she's coming out of this experience of extraordinary betrayal, public humiliation, watching somebody else get credit for her work, and the entire scientific establishment say, that's how it's, yeah, we're going to support Saul and we're going to ostracize
Yeah.
you. She goes into Est. She's so fragile and she has a complete psychotic break.
Yeah. Tragic. Tragic. Pamela, I can talk with you for hours. And as we're discussing this story, I was thinking of Ramadan Shabazz, who was a Vietnam vet who got addicted to heroin, came back. VA didn't help him, committed a crime and robbed a store and murdered two people, was on death row,
God
who
bless.
eventually, after 51 years and getting a master's in prison, gets a commutation of sentence. I interviewed him. As we were doing, I was like, I know this part of the story, and this. There's so many fascinating things to overlap. But as we wrap up, I just want to just hold up this amazing work that you did. How
Thank
many
you.
years? 7 years of research
It
and
was
writing?
7 years, thinking I didn't know this is what my life was going to do. But
Candace Pert, Genius, Greed, and Madness in the World of Science. So many important lessons for today. And any last words are yours for our
I
listeners.
wish, I just said, even though Candace did some really bad things, I really just love her. I continue to love
Hmm.
her. And I hope that people read the book, and I hope that they read it with compassion and understanding that she was shaped by, both as a woman and as a scientist, by these greater systems. And what I would love for people to do is really look deeply at our healthcare system and
Hmm.
at our other systems, and sort of say, are they really healthy, and sort of take some individual accountability about our own behavior, and in the context of some of these systems that, again, I think are reward greed and other
Yeah.
antisocial qualities.
And aspire to goodness and aspire
Aspire
to
to
helping
goodness.
others. Think
Yes,
of our
please.
children and our great grandchildren and many more generations. We need to protect our planet. Thank you,
Yes,
Pamela
please. Thank you.
Ryckman. Wonderful interview. Thank you.
Thank you. I loved it.
Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the Super Thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.